Rain ran in narrow rivers along Milsom Street, and Barbara O'Brien walked beside Lady Ashcombe's carriage because a paid companion was not permitted to arrive dry. Water slipped through the cracks in her slippers and pressed cold against her skin at every step. Her hem grew heavier with each yard, dragging at her calves. The coachman did not glance down. Lady Ashcombe's silhouette moved behind the glass, upright and still, a pale oval above satin. Barbara kept one hand against the carriage panel to steady herself on the slick stones and carried the other close to her ribs, where hunger had hollowed her until even breathing felt deliberate. By the time the lamps of the upper rooms came into view through the rain, her fingers had gone numb. She had laced Lady Ashcombe and both Miss Ashcombes into their evening gowns an hour earlier, pulling silk tight until her own knuckles split at the cuticles. The raw places burned in the wet. Her left wrist throbbed beneath a borrowed glove one size too small. Lady Ashcombe had caught it that morning and twisted when Barbara hesitated over the accounts ledger. Not hard enough to leave a mark where a physician might see. Hard enough to purple the bone. The glove hid it poorly, but appearances in Bath were an art of strategic blindness. At the entrance steps, footmen hurried forward with umbrellas for titled women and looked through Barbara as if she were a post. Two gentlemen under the portico watched her climb the slick stone and lowered their voices only enough to make cruelty polite. Another dependent. Plain one. Useful, I should think. Their wives did not rebuke them. One lady adjusted her fan and examined Barbara's wet hem with that mild curiosity reserved for damaged goods. Lady Ashcombe descended from the carriage on a footman's arm, rose-water perfume and rustling silk, announcing her before her shoes touched stone. She did not look at Barbara when she spoke. Keep close. Do not speak unless spoken to. If anyone asks, you are with me to attend my daughters. She gave the sentence that had replaced Barbara's name all season. My useful girl. Inside, heat rose from crowded bodies and candle wax, but it did not reach the marble pillar where Barbara was placed. Lady Ashcombe and her daughters moved into the bright centre, as if the room had opened to receive them. Barbara remained at the edge with wraps over one arm, spare gloves in her reticule, and the patience expected of furniture. Music climbed and folded, violin and pianoforte carrying the first quadrille across polished floorboards. She stood without shifting weight because movement drew correction. Her wet hem cooled, then chilled, then clung. No one asked whether she had eaten. No one would have expected that she had. In the servants' corridor behind the supper room, between lacing and pinning and fetching, she had swallowed half a crust of stale bread and a sip of thin negus left on a tray. She had done it quickly, standing while two kitchen maids carried tureens past her and did not meet her eyes. Hunger remained. It sat low and sharp under her ribs. An orderly pain, familiar as the seam at her cuff. The first set formed with a sweep of bows and curtsies. Then the room altered, not in sound but in attention. Men at the card tables straightened. Mothers turned their daughters by the elbow to better sight line. The Duke of Ravensmere had entered without announcement, and still every face registered him within moments. Barbara saw him first in fragments between shoulders, dark coat cut to military severity, broad frame held with rigid economy, profile carved clean as winter stone. When he stepped fully into the candlelight, the details settled into one hard fact, tall enough to look over most men in the room. Dark hair brushed back from a scar at his temple, eyes the colour of deep water before a storm. He did what was expected of him. He danced with Lady Kendall, with the widow from Queen Square, with two titled sisters in matching lilac silk, with a marchioness whose diamonds flashed with every turn. He asked, he bowed, he moved with perfect form. Barbara watched because everyone watched. She told herself it was only that. Yet each time the set rotated, his gaze found the edge of the floor where she stood against the pillar, and held a fraction too long before returning to his partner. Not enough for gossip, enough for awareness. The first time she thought she had mistaken direction. The second, she lowered her eyes to the waxed boards. The third, her skin prickled beneath damp linen, and she fixed her attention on the buckle of Lady Ashcombe's shoe. Lady Ashcombe noticed where the Duke looked before she noticed why. Her smile remained fixed as she accepted a compliment from a colonel, but her fingers tightened around her fan until the ivory ribs creaked. One of the Miss Ashcombes, flushed from dancing, returned to Barbara only long enough to exchange gloves. "Do not stand so near the light," she said softly. "You make your face look hungry." Barbara took the damp gloves and bowed her head. "Yes, miss. Also, your hair is escaping pins. See to it." Barbara moved to a shadowed section of wall and adjusted her dark hair with fingertips that trembled from cold. A maid passed carrying lemonade and offered the tray to 3 ladies without pausing for her. She did not ask. In rooms like this, asking became evidence. By the second hour, her shoulders ached from stillness. Pins dug at her scalp. The borrowed stays cut under her ribs each time she drew breath too deeply. She measured the evening in tasks performed without witness, fastening a broken clasp at Miss Ashcombe's nape, blotting wine from Lady Ashcombe's sleeve before it could stain, carrying a dropped reticule back through moving dancers, finding a misplaced handkerchief under a card table while gentlemen discussed horses over her bent back as if she were deaf. She was 22 and had learned to fold herself small inside public rooms, to move quickly enough to be useful and silently enough to be denied. Captain O'Brien would have despised it. The thought came as clean pain. Her father had taught her figures at the breakfast table with ink on his cuffs and patience in his voice, showing her how columns answered if questioned properly. He had kept a modest trust in her name for a future that included choice. Then the ship went down in heavy weather, and debt and condolence arrived in the same post. Her mother married Sir Ashcombe 6 months later, coughed through one winter, and was buried by spring. Lady Ashcombe took the household keys, then the accounts, then Barbara's room, then Barbara's surname in practice, if not in law. Miss Ashcombe's companion in one drawing-room, my useful girl in the next. The trust diminished year by year through withdrawals explained as necessity and never explained at all. A bell marked the interval before the next dances. Guests drifted towards supper in laughing clusters. Barbara was sent not to table but to corridor where servants exchanged platters and steam fogged the narrow panes. She stood beside a crate of oranges and finished the other half of her stale crust. The bread scratched her throat going down. She closed her eyes for one breath and pressed her thumb against the bruise in her wrist until the sharpness steadied her. In her reticule, beneath spare pins and a folded handkerchief, the little notebook rested against her palm when she checked it by touch. Cheap cover, tight script, estate arithmetic copied by candlelight, legal citations from her father's old volumes, pages she had no right to keep and no right to forget. Numbers did not pity. They also did not lie. When she returned to the ballroom, the second quadrille had begun. Lady Ashcombe waved her over with 2 fingers and handed her a fan damp at the handle. "You will stand there," she said, indicating the pillar again. "If spoken to, you are to say you assist my daughters from kindness." Barbara met her gaze once. "Yes, my lady." Lady Ashcombe's smile sharpened. "You are not to drift into notice." Barbara inclined her head and took her place. Across the room the Duke changed partners again, a viscount's daughter this time, pale blue silk at his arm. His expression did not alter from one dance to the next. Command lived in the set of his shoulders. Distance lived in his mouth. Yet, at the end of each figure, when dancers separated and turned, his eyes crossed the space to where she stood with an empty stomach and wet shoes, and a hidden bruise and a name used like a leash. She could not tell what he saw. She only knew he saw. The first dance set ended to applause and chatter and the scrape of chairs near the card room. No one approached her. No one offered introduction. Lady Ashcombe moved deeper into conversation, radiant and secure, while her daughters laughed beside a cluster of officers. Barbara remained against marble, damp and aching, more isolated in a crowded room than she had ever been in her attic chamber. She kept her face still. She kept her back straight. She slipped her hand into her reticule and touched the notebook once. A private weight, the last part of herself no one had yet managed to spend. She slipped her hand back out of the reticule before anyone could notice the motion, but the small pressure of the notebook against her palm remained like a second pulse. A servant passed with a silver tray of ratafia glasses and tilted it away from her without breaking stride. Two ladies drifted near the pillar, speaking low and sharp beneath fan ribs. "Lady Ashcombe keeps a companion now," one said. "No, that is the girl she rescued from her husband's first marriage," the other answered, the word rescued shaped to wound. Barbara kept her eyes on the floorboards. Lady Ashcombe did not wait for her to come. She crossed the distance herself with rose water and silk, and that thin smile that always meant work disguised as kindness. "Mrs. Talford has misplaced her shawl. You will find it. Miss Henrietta has torn her hem. You will mend it now. And if anyone asks who you are, you will say you are with us by my charity." Barbara bowed. "Yes, my lady." Lady Ashcombe's fingers landed on her bruised wrist, exactly where morning pain still lived, and pressed as if testing whether the lesson remained. "Louder," she said. Barbara lifted her voice without lifting her head. "By your charity, my lady." Approval touched Lady Ashcombe's mouth for an instant, then vanished as she turned back toward the card room, where gentlemen in dark coats laughed over coin and consequence. Barbara moved through them to retrieve the shawl from a chair arm, and every step brought her father back with cruel precision. Captain O'Brien in a navy coat gone shiny at the elbows, ink stain on his thumb, teaching her at 11 to balance household accounts because figures did not flatter and did not forgive. His hand flattening over hers to steady the pen. His voice saying, "Write every withdrawal, Bee, even when they tell you there is no need." He had called her Bee when she forgot to eat while reading. He had promised her a modest trust, enough for choice, if never for luxury. Then came heavy weather in the Channel, then 3 letters in 1 week, then a sealed notice with Admiralty wording so dry it made grief feel bureaucratic. She had stood in the morning room with black ribbon in her hair and learned that men could disappear beneath water while creditors remained perfectly buoyant. By Michaelmas of that year the silver had been sold, the hunter gone, the steward dismissed, and Sir Ashcombe had begun calling with sympathy and practical advice about economies. By Christmas he wore her mother's gratitude like a decoration. By Easter her mother wore his ring, and Barbara's future was recast as a column in someone else's ledger. Miss Henrietta found her in the retiring room with needle and thread already in hand, and presented the damaged skirt as though handing over waste. "You pulled this too tight before dinner," she said. "You must have done, because I certainly did not." Miss Clara laughed from the mirror while a maid arranged orange blossoms in her hair. "She pulls everything too tight, laces, seams, faces." Barbara knelt on the carpet and worked the torn silk with quick, careful stitches, damp hem soaking through her skirt to her knees. The room smelled of powder, warm wax, and the sweet rot of flowers left too near heat. Miss Henrietta spoke to the maid, but aimed each word at Barbara. "Do you remember when she slept in the blue room? Imagine! She thought herself equal to us because her father kept 2 horses." Miss Clara turned, earrings swaying. "And a pianoforte. She used to play in the afternoons. Mother nearly fainted when she discovered it was in tune." They laughed again, soft enough to seem refined. Barbara tied the thread and bit it clean. The blue room had become Miss Henrietta's dressing chamber the month after the wedding. Her trunks had gone to the attic under the eaves, where frost formed on the inside of winter glass, and rain found the cracked slate above the bed. Her mother had coughed through that first winter as if each breath scraped. Lady Ashcombe had arrived in the household as if she had always belonged there, bringing new curtains, new servants loyal to her purse, and a new order of precedence, in which Barbara became function and cautionary tale. The cook was instructed that companions ate after family, and only if supper remained. The seamstress was told to alter old gowns for Barbara instead of ordering cloth. The butler stopped announcing her surname to guests. By spring, Lady Ashcombe began introductions that made strangers smile and Barbara burn. "My useful girl," she would say, hand light on Barbara's shoulder, the pressure gentle enough to look affectionate from a distance. The phrase travelled faster than truth. When her mother died before summer ended, there was a week of black crape and crowded condolences, then accounts to settle. Sir Ashcombe signed whatever papers Lady Ashcombe placed before him, especially after cards ran badly and he needed ready cash. Withdrawals from Captain O'Brien's trust increased. Fees appeared. Emergency expenditures appeared. Guardian allocations appeared. Barbara asked once, at 17, with her father's account book open and both hands steady. Lady Ashcombe struck the table with the edge of a ruler so hard the inkwell jumped. "Children do not audit their elders," she said. "Dependents do not question their shelter." The next day Barbara's key to the small library vanished. The day after, her writing desk moved from the attic landing to the nursery school room for kindling. She learned to copy figures standing at a washstand by candle end, pages balanced against a cracked picture, and to hide what she copied inside dress linings and prayer books and, eventually, the little notebook, now sleeping in her reticule. When she returned to the ballroom with mended hem and recovered shawl, Lady Ashcombe did not thank her. She merely lifted her chin toward the supper room and said, "Miss Clara requires warm negus. Miss Henrietta requires lemon ice. Do not confuse the trays again." Barbara had not confused them. She curtsied and obeyed. In the servants' passage she exchanged one tray for another, while steam from the kitchens blurred her sight, and hunger sharpened it. A scullery maid she recognised from Ashcombe House glanced at her wrist as Barbara reached for the jug. "That bruise is worse," the girl whispered. Barbara pulled the glove higher. "It is nothing." The girl hesitated, then dropped her voice further. "Cook says Lady Ashcombe sold your mother's cameo this morning, the blue one with seed pearls." Barbara set the jug down very carefully so it would not shake. "Thank you," she said, because there was nothing else to say. That cameo had been the only thing her mother left by explicit bequest, wrapped in linen with Barbara's name in a trembling hand. Lady Ashcombe had held it for safekeeping after the funeral, then for inventory, then for valuation, and now, apparently, for sale. Even grief became collateral in that household. She carried the trays out through the side door where music struck her again like weather and moved among guests who consumed sweetness while speaking about duty. A baronet's wife stopped her with 2 fingers. "Girl, where is Lady Ashcombe's fan?" Barbara answered with formal calm. "I shall fetch it at once, madam." The woman looked her over from damp cuff to plain bodice. "Such a pity when families must keep relations as staff." Barbara bowed and walked on before shame could show itself in her face. At the edge of the card-room she glimpsed Mr. Penrith through cigar haze, red-cheeked and intent over whist, one of the same creditors who had once lingered in Ashcombe House after midnight, waiting for notes to be signed. The sight pulled Sir Ashcombe back as memory rather than presence. He had always been kind in the empty way of men who mistake lenience for care. He had never struck her. He had also never once asked where she slept. He signed notes, lost money, borrowed more, and told himself the household was managed. Lady Ashcombe managed it indeed, through withholding, through spectacle, through the daily subtraction of dignity from any person beneath her. Barbara knew the arithmetic by heart. 1 public correction before breakfast, 2 errands without coat in rain, 3 reminders that gratitude was owed, 4 ounces of bread if dinner was thin, 1 twist of the wrist for insolence defined as silence. By the second week of the bath season, Barbara had stopped counting bruises and resumed counting withdrawals instead, because one ledger might yet condemn what polite society excused. She had copied dates when she could, signatures when she dared, and statutes when memory failed. The legal citations in her notebook were not rebellion, they were oxygen. Without them she would have been only what Lady Ashcombe named her. A new set was called. Chairs scraped, couples formed lines with practised smiles. Barbara returned to her pillar carrying the fan, the shawl, and both daughters' discarded gloves like trophies from battles no one acknowledged. Miss Clara took her gloves without thanks and said, "Do not stand so near the musicians. Your face distracts." Miss Henrietta added, "And stop looking at the dancers. It invites confusion." Barbara lowered her gaze. "Yes, miss." Lady Ashcombe accepted her fan and addressed a neighbouring countess with bright amusement. "The child is useful with pins and figures, though she has no notion of manner." The countess peered at Barbara as one might inspect a cracked cup. "Relations can be troublesome," Lady Ashcombe sighed delicately. "I keep her from worse circumstances." Barbara felt the words move through the room, each one polishing the lie. She stood still and let the old inventory rise and settle again. Father gone under black water, mother buried before the second marriage year, trust diminished by signatures she had not seen, room taken, lessons stopped, name reduced, bread rationed, labour endless, pity offered in place of justice. Yet beneath the list another fact endured, stubborn as bone. She remembered what Captain O'Brien taught her at the breakfast table, and memory had become method. If she stayed silent in these rooms, it was not because she believed their verdict. It was because she was waiting for a moment when proof would weigh more than rank. Across the floor, as couples bowed into the opening figure, the Duke of Ravensmere turned with his partner and looked directly toward the pillar again. His expression remained cold, his posture remained exact, but his attention did not pass over her, as everyone else's did. Barbara tightened her fingers around the reticule strap until the cheap leather pressed crescents into her skin, and held her place while the music rose and the evening carried her suffering like a secret no one had yet bothered to read. The music rose and Lady Ashcombe turned her head as if listening to it, though her eyes fixed on Barbara alone. She crossed the distance between them in measured steps, smile polished for nearby witnesses, fan moving in a gentle arc that suggested affection. From beneath the fan she pressed a sealed note into Barbara's gloved hand, so swiftly that no one watching could have named the motion. "Sir Lionel Creed," she murmured without moving her lips, "in the West Card Room. Before midnight. Place it in his hand and return." Barbara felt the hard edge of wax through paper. no address on the fold, no crest she recognised. Lady Ashcombe's smile widened for a passing countess. "And at dawn," she said softly, "you will leave Bath as his wife. He has accepted terms in settlement. Do not force me to discuss what happens if you refuse." Her perfume sat heavy in Barbara's throat. Rose water over something sour. Barbara kept her face still. "My father's trust cannot be settled through me without consent." "It already has been." Lady Ashcombe's fan snapped shut. "Speak one word of this to anyone, and I will swear you begged for the match. You are a dependent. He is a creditor. Society will believe arithmetic before tears." She drifted away before Barbara could answer, and two matrons immediately absorbed her into conversation, as if cruelty and courtesy were one seamless fabric. Barbara stood with the note hidden in her palm, and the room tilting around her in bright circles of candlelight and silk. Her pulse struck hard at her throat. Sir Lionel Creed. She knew the name from ledgers and from evenings when men with ruined cuffs and careful voices lingered too late in Ashcombe House. A waltz began at the centre of the floor. It was not on the printed card. Someone laughed and called it daring. The Duke of Ravensmere took a marchioness by the hand and moved into the set with exact, unhurried control. He did not look toward the pillar now. His attention remained where etiquette required it. The fact steadied her more than comfort would have done. Men like him obeyed rule and consequence. Men like Sir Lionel used shadows between rules. Barbara slipped from the ballroom edge and entered the side passage beside the conservatory, one hand closed over the note, the other lifting her damp hem above stone. The corridor was dimmer than the main rooms, lit by two wall sconces, and reflected moonlight through wet glass. Rain tapped the panes in quick, nervous beats. Ferns crowded the far wall, broad leaves dark as lacquer. Laughter from the ballroom reached her in softened bursts, and then fell away. She did not go directly to the card room. She ducked instead behind a marble plinth where an empty jardiniere stood and opened the folded paper with her thumbnail. The seal cracked with a dry sound that seemed too loud in the narrow passage. Ink swam before her eyes for 1 second, then sharpened. "I, Barbara O'Brien, renounce all claim to the O'Brien Trust and acknowledge prior disbursement under guardianship in full. I consent to immediate marriage with Sir Lionel Creed for settlement of family debt and relinquish all present and future petition." Below, blank space waited for her signature. Beneath that, a line already signed in Sir Ashcombe's hand and witnessed with a name she knew to be dead 6 months. For an instant she could not draw air properly. Not debt reminder. Not request. Confession forged in advance. Consent manufactured. She folded the paper once, twice, with care that came from old training, and put it back in her reticule beside her notebook. Her fingers shook against the clasp. From the conservatory door came a rush of feet, quick and careless, then a strangled sound. A little girl in white muslin stumbled into the passage, one hand at her throat, eyes wide with blank terror. She was no more than 8, dark blonde hair loose from its ribbons, pearls flashing at her collar. Barbara knew her by sight from introductions she had heard and never joined. Lady Imogen Ravensmere, the Duke's niece, far too young to be presented. Lady Imogen tried to call for help and produced only a harsh, choking gasp. Then she dropped to her knees on the tile. 2 footmen at the corridor turn froze as if the scene had stepped outside their training. One took half a stride forward and then stopped, looking toward the ballroom as though rank must arrive before action. A matron behind him gave a small scream and pressed her fan to her mouth. Barbara was moving before thought caught up. She dropped beside Lady Imogen, silk soaking at once where her skirt met wet stone, and put one hand between the young girl's shoulders while the other lifted her chin. No speech, no cough. Airway blocked. Sugared almonds were on every tray tonight. She had seen Lady Imogen laughing near one between sets. "Do not crowd her," Barbara said, sharper than she had ever spoken in that house or any drawing-room. "Give space, now!" No one obeyed. They stared. Lady Imogen's face blanched toward grey. Her fingers clawed at Barbara's sleeve. Barbara hooked 2 fingers into the neckline of her own glove, tore it free with her teeth, and felt blindly in her hair for the long pin anchoring the back coil. It came loose with half her dark hair, which fell over her shoulder and cheek. She wiped her bare hand against her wet skirt, braced Lady Imogen's jaw, and worked with small, precise motion at the side of the mouth, not forcing, not digging, just enough to dislodge what sat where breathing should be. "Breathe," she whispered, though the girl could not answer. "Again. Come on." The footman made a helpless sound. "Should I fetch a physician?" "After she breathes." That voice cut across the passage like a drawn blade. "Stand away from her." The command came from the doorway at the end of the corridor, low and absolute. Conversation from the ballroom dimmed as people sensed title and danger in the same breath. The Duke of Ravensmere stood framed by glass and rain, coat dark at the shoulders, drops still sliding from his collar. He had likely come in from the terrace route. Water marked his boots. His jaw looked carved hard enough to strike sparks. No one moved quickly enough for him. He crossed the tiles in 3 strides, seized the nearest gentleman by the sleeve, and set him back, without apparent force yet, with complete success. "Back," he said, "all of you." Barbara did not look up. Lady Imogen convulsed once against her arm. Something small and sticky shifted under Barbara's fingers. Then the girl coughed. A sugared almond fragment struck the tile and spun to a stop by Barbara's knee. Air rushed in with a ragged, desperate sound. Lady Imogen bent forward and coughed again, this time with tears and fury and life. The corridor exhaled all at once. Someone began to cry. Someone else said, "Thank God," as if gratitude absolved delay. Barbara supported Lady Imogen through the coughs until they settled into harsh but regular breaths. Only then did she lift her head. The Duke was beside them, one knee on the wet tile, close enough that she could see raindrops caught in the dark line of his lashes. Up close he was more severe than at distance, broad shoulders filling the narrow corridor. Mouth set flat. Eyes not cold now, but fixed with dangerous concentration on his niece's face, then on Barbara's hands, then on the torn edge of Barbara's bodice, seam where the rush and strain had pulled stitches apart. "Imogen!" His voice lowered by 1 degree. "Look at me!" Lady Imogen nodded weakly, still coughing, and clutched Barbara's sleeve with shaking fingers. "Uncle, you are breathing!" He touched her shoulder once, brief and precise, then looked to the nearest footman. "Water, clean cloth, now!" The man ran. Barbara started to shift back, meaning to yield place, but the Duke's hand came up, palm outward, not touching her, and still stopping her as effectively as a wall. "Do not move!" It was a command. It was also, unmistakably, concern for the girl still braced against Barbara's arm. Barbara held where she was, knees aching on stone, wet skirt clinging cold to her shins. Her loosened hair stuck to her throat. Blood from a small cut at her knuckle had marked one finger where the hairpin bit her skin. Lady Ashcombe's voice carried from the passage mouth, high with performative alarm. "What has happened? Imogen, dear child!" The Duke didn't turn. "Silence!" The word landed, and even Lady Ashcombe stopped. A physician appeared, as if conjured by rank, spectacles fogged, breath short from haste. He examined Lady Imogen while Barbara stayed beside her until the man nodded and said, "Oh, airway clear, shock only, keep her warm, no further immediate danger." At that, Lady Imogen finally released Barbara's sleeve and leaned against her uncle, eyes closed, breath still rough. The Duke rose in one controlled motion and offered his arm to his niece. She took it. He waited until she stood steady between physician and maid. Then he looked back at Barbara for the first time, as a subject separate from the emergency. She rose more slowly. Her knees threatened to fold once before locking. Wet silk dragged at her ankles. The corridor had filled with watchers, faces pale above jewels and lace, every gaze fixed on her. Cold air found the torn seam at her side. Loose hair clung in damp strands across one shoulder. Inside her reticule, the note pressed like a hidden blade. Ravensmere stepped closer, not close enough to breach propriety, but close enough that his voice did not need to travel. "You will come with us to the withdrawing room," he said. Lady Ashcombe broke in immediately, smile strained and bright. "Your Grace, my companion has had a trying evening. I shall take charge of her." His gaze shifted to Lady Ashcombe, with no change in expression and no trace of social warmth. "You will do nothing." The corridor went very still. Barbara drew one breath and answered, before fear could silence precision. "Your Grace, she must sip water slowly. If she drinks too quickly, she will cough again." His eyes returned to her. "You gave orders to my household staff." She could not breathe before she could be frightened. A pause, rain against glass. Distant violin from the ballroom, starting another set for people who wished to pretend the night remained ordinary. He looked at her bare hand, at the glove dangling from her other wrist, at the bruise shadowing beneath the too small cuff, at her mouth pale from hunger and strain, and then at the slight tremor she could not suppress now that action had ended. When he spoke again, each sentence struck clean. "You are shaking." He held her gaze. "You have not eaten." His eyes dropped once, briefly, to her left wrist where the glove had slipped during the rescue. "Who struck your wrist?" She didn't answer. Not because she had no answer, because the corridor was full, and truth in the wrong air could be buried as quickly as it was spoken. She straightened, forcing steadiness into her spine, and met the Duke's gaze without curtsy or apology. "Lady Imogen needed air. That is all that matters." Something altered in his face. Not softness, not yet. A stillness deeper than cold, as if he had heard both what she said and what she refused to say. By 11:30, the rain had not eased, and Barbara stood in a side withdrawing room with damp hair at her neck, a forged confession in her reticule, and the Duke of Ravensmere watching her as if the evening had only just begun. The withdrawing room was small for the number of people pressing toward its door, and heat from the fire could not drive out the damp that came in with wet coats and frightened breath. Lady Imogen sat on a chaise wrapped in a wool travelling blanket, her thin shoulders shaking between coughs she tried to hide from the adults around her. A maid held a basin. The physician held a watch in one hand and 2 fingers at the child's wrist with the other. Barbara remained near the arm of the chaise because every time she stepped back, Lady Imogen's hand searched the air until it found her sleeve again. Slowly," Barbara said, lowering a glass toward the girl's mouth. "A sip only." "Then wait." Lady Imogen obeyed her before she obeyed anyone else. She swallowed, winced, and looked up through wet lashes. "It hurts." "I know." Barbara adjusted the blanket around her neck. "It will ease." The Duke stood at the hearth with one hand behind his back and the other braced on the mantel, unmoving except for the turn of his head whenever his niece breathed too sharply. Candlelight deepened the scar at his temple. Rain shone on his coat where it had not yet dried. He did not interrupt. He watched each motion as if memorising it. Lady Ashcombe entered fully then, bringing rosewater and authority and the rustle of expensive silk that announced itself before any word did. Her daughters hovered behind her in matching alarm, each one careful to appear distressed and untouched by practical work. Lady Ashcombe approached the chaise with a soft cry pitched for sympathy. "Poor lamb! What negligence! In these crowded rooms one cannot trust under-servants to keep dangerous sweets from children." The maid with the basin flinched at once, and lowered her eyes. She could not have been more than 16. Barbara felt the movement without looking. It was the same recoil she had made for years. The physician cleared his throat and gave his verdict with professional caution. "The obstruction is removed, Your Grace. Her airway is clear. She must be kept warm and quiet for the next hour. No hard sweets this evening." Ravensmere inclined his head once. "You will remain nearby." "Certainly, Your Grace." When the physician stepped back, Lady Ashcombe reached for Lady Imogen's hand, but the child turned instinctively toward Barbara instead. It was a small movement. It changed the room. Lady Ashcombe's fingers paused in empty space and curled back around her fan. "My dear," she said to the child, smile fixed, "you frightened us all. Tell us who gave you the almond." Lady Imogen's mouth tightened. She glanced at the maid, then at her uncle, then lowered her face into the blanket. Ravensmere spoke without raising his voice. "She will not be questioned now." Lady Ashcombe recovered in an instant. "Of course, only to prevent repetition." Barbara set the water-glass down on a side table and reached for a cloth. Her hands were steady now because they had work. She folded the cloth once, twice, and held it against Lady Imogen's throat, where the skin had reddened. The child sighed at the coolness and closed her eyes. Outside, a quadrille resumed. The music came faint through 2 doors, bright and disciplined, and entirely detached from the room where fear still clung like smoke. By the time the long case clock in the corridor marked 1/4 to midnight, Lady Imogen's cough had thinned to an occasional rough breath. Ravensmere sent 1 footman for broth and another to clear the doorway. Guests who had no claim to remain were guided out. The room settled into fewer bodies and sharper stakes. The Duke, Lady Imogen, Barbara, Lady Ashcombe, the 2 Miss Ashcombes, the trembling maid with the basin, and the physician writing notes no one would read unless compelled. Lady Ashcombe turned to the Duke and placed one gloved hand over her heart. "Your Grace, I must insist this matter be managed discreetly. Rumour is cruel to young ladies. A servant's carelessness with almonds is unfortunate, but it need not become conversation." The maid went white. "My lady, I did not—" "Silence," Lady Ashcombe said, without looking at her. "You carried the tray." "I carried lemonade, my lady." "Then you left the sweets where children could reach them." "Is that your defence?" The girl's lips trembled. "I was told to set them in the conservatory for the gentlemen." Lady Ashcombe gave a soft, sorrowful laugh meant for polished rooms. "There! You see how quickly excuses multiply." Barbara looked at the maid then. Plain cap, red hands, a burn mark along the wrist where kitchen work had kissed skin and moved on. No advocate, no room for mistake. She knew the shape of the trap before the next sentence arrived. Lady Ashcombe turned her gaze to Barbara with almost maternal patience. "Miss O'Brien was present. She can confirm the sequence. You saw this girl near the child, did you not?" The request was gentle. The command beneath it was not. Confirm the lie, seal the blame downward, preserve the lady, end the matter. Barbara felt the forged paper in her reticule like heat against her hip. She saw with cruel clarity how the same method worked in every room. Write the account first, then force witnesses to inhabit it. Ravensmere did not intervene. He watched. Barbara rose from the chaise and stood between Lady Imogen and the centre of the room. neither deferential nor confrontational, simply placed where her voice would carry, if required. She folded her torn glove into her palm. "I cannot confirm that, my lady." Lady Ashcombe's smile thinned. "You cannot, or you will not." "I will not speak what is untrue." Miss Clara inhaled sharply. Miss Henrietta muttered, "Insolent!" Lady Ashcombe's tone cooled by degrees. "Then speak what you claim is true." Barbara kept her eyes on Lady Ashcombe, not the Duke, because this answer was owed in one direction and witnessed in another. The sweets were on the conservatory table at shoulder height for an adult, not hidden and not attended. Lady Imogen entered the passage at speed while the musicians changed sets. No servant placed food in her hand in my sight. The maid with the basin ran toward her when she began to choke. She did not stand idle. Lady Ashcombe flicked open her fan. "How convenient that your memory serves those beneath you." "My memory serves sequence." "Your sequence leaves no one responsible." Barbara drew a measured breath. "A child reached for a sweet in a crowded house. The danger was real. Malice was not." For the first time since entering, Lady Ashcombe dropped pretense. Her voice went low and flat. "You are forgetting your position." Barbara did not lower her gaze. "I am remembering it exactly." Lady Imogen spoke then from the chaise, hoarse but clear. "Martha told me not to run." Every head turned. The maid made a broken sound and pressed her fist to her mouth. The child continued, eyes on her blanket. "I laughed at her and ran anyway. She chased me." Ravensmere crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt by his niece. He did not touch her immediately. He waited until she lifted her eyes to his. "Thank you for speaking plainly," he said. She nodded once, exhausted, and leaned her head against the cushion. He rose and turned to the maid. "Your name?" "Martha Bell, Your Grace." "You will not be dismissed for this." Tears spilled down Martha's cheeks before she could hide them. "Thank you, Your Grace." Lady Ashcombe snapped her fan shut. "Your Grace, no one proposed dismissal. We only sought clarity." He looked at her, with winter in his face. "Clarity has been provided." Silence pooled in the room. The physician's pen stopped scratching. One of the Miss Ashcombes stared at the floor as if the pattern might open and swallow her. Barbara bent to adjust Lady Imogen's blanket again, partly for the child's comfort, and partly so her own shaking would not be visible. Action had carried her through the refusal. After action came consequence. She knew that rhythm too well. Lady Ashcombe moved closer and spoke so softly only Barbara could hear. "You have chosen very badly." Barbara answered in the same register. "No, my lady. I chose exactly." Lady Ashcombe stepped back before anyone could read her mouth and resumed social tone as if nothing sharp had passed. "Miss O'Brien is overtired. She mistakes defiance for principle." Ravensmere heard enough. "Miss O'Brien has done what every adult in this room failed to do quickly." Lady Ashcombe's head turned. "Failed? You heard me." The physician gathered his case and bowed himself out at the Duke's nod. One Miss Ashcombe followed, then the other, eager to leave the line of fire while preserving expression. Lady Ashcombe remained 3 beats longer, calculating, then dipped the shallowest curtsy propriety permitted. "If Lady Imogen needs anything, send for me." Ravensmere's reply was immediate. "I shall send if needed." She withdrew with silk and scent and the measured step of a woman not yet defeated, though for the first time that evening she had not controlled the room she stood in. When the door closed behind her, sound changed. The house seemed to exhale. Rain tapped the window panes. The distant music had shifted to a reel. Martha Bell wiped her face with her apron and looked toward Barbara with raw gratitude she did not dare speak aloud. Ravensmere addressed her instead. Take my niece to the Blue Guest Chamber. Sit outside her door for the night. You will be relieved at dawn." Martha curtsied, still crying quietly. "Yes, Your Grace." Lady Imogen reached for Barbara's hand before she was led away. Her fingers were small and warm now. "Will you come tomorrow?" Barbara glanced at the Duke, then back to the child. "If Your Grace allows," Ravensmere answered before she could wonder. "You may see her in the morning." Lady Imogen released her and went with Martha, blanket trailing at her heels like a little cloak. The door latched softly behind them. Barbara and the Duke were left in the firelit room with wet footprints on tile, and one overturned chair no one had yet bothered to right. He stood near the table where she had set the water glass. She stood near the chaise, aware of torn seam, loose hair, and hunger arriving again now that urgency had loosened its grip. He spoke first. "You could have agreed with Lady Ashcombe and spared yourself trouble." "I am familiar with trouble, Your Grace." "That was not an answer." She lifted her chin. "It was the honest one." His mouth shifted by a fraction. Not quite a smile. Something harder and more uncertain. He looked toward the closed door, then back to her. "You protected a servant who had no shield." "She told the child not to run. She would have been punished for doing her duty." "And you," Barbara gave the smallest shrug, "I am punished for less." The line fell between them, plain and unadorned. He did not offer easy reassurance, and she would not have trusted it if he had. Instead, he held out his hand. "The glove?" She hesitated, then placed the torn glove in his palm. He set it aside and examined the cut at her knuckle with a soldier's economy, not touching until he had looked. "Sit. I am well enough to stand." "Sit." The command carried no heat, only insistence. She obeyed because her knees had begun to tremble again. He poured water from the carafe, added a small measure of spirits from a decanter, and handed it to her. "Drink." She did, and the burn steadied her breath. His gaze dropped to her reticule where the clasp had split one stitch. "What are you carrying that makes you hold it as if it were a weapon?" She did not answer immediately. This was the crossing she had delayed for years, not hours. Proof kept hidden could preserve her for a week, perhaps a month. Proof surrendered might vanish or might become the only thing that stopped the machinery already set in motion against her name. He waited without prompting. That, more than command, decided her. Barbara opened the reticule and drew out the folded, forged confession first. She set it on the table between them. Then she took out the small notebook, its cover worn at the corners, pages crowded with figures and citations in neat ink. She held it for a moment with both hands, thumb resting over her father's initials inside the front board, and then placed it beside the paper. "Lady Ashcombe ordered me to deliver that document to Sir Lionel Creed before midnight," she said. "It renounces my legal claim and states consent to marriage for debt settlement. The witness signature is from a man buried last winter." Ravensmere unfolded the sheet and read. The skin along his jaw tightened once and went still. Barbara touched the notebook lightly. "These are copies of withdrawals from Captain O'Brien's trust over 5 years, with dates, amounts, and corresponding entries from household accounts when I could access them. I added statute references regarding guardianship powers and marriage consent for women of age. I am 22. No guardian may compel my marriage under lawful settlement." He looked up. "Why give this to me?" "Because if I keep it tonight, Lady Ashcombe will take it before dawn. If I give it to Sir Lionel, I vanish into his carriage by morning. If I burn it, Martha Bell survives this hour, and I do not survive the week." The fire cracked in the grate. Rain eased to a softer patter. She finished, voice low but steady. "You asked who struck my wrist. The answer is less useful than this. He placed his hand over the notebook, not possessive, not casual, simply a vow in gesture. This will be copied at once and lodged with my solicitor before midnight. Barbara released a breath she had not known she was holding. You understand, she said, that Lady Ashcombe will deny every line. Then she will deny it before records and witnesses, not in a corridor. His eyes held hers, level and relentless. You did not weaponize this for advantage. You surrendered it to prevent further harm. She did not know what to do with the recognition in that statement. It was too exact. It landed where armour was thin. I surrendered it because I am tired of being instructed to lie. He inclined his head once, as if accepting terms in a negotiation that mattered. At the corridor door he called for his man of business in a voice that carried through oak and plaster without strain. Boots answered almost immediately. A grey-haired gentleman entered, pencase already in hand, and bowed. Mr. Hale, Ravensmere indicated the table. Take copies now, one set to Magistrate Fenwick tonight, one set sealed to my chambers. The originals remain in my custody until dawn. Mr. Hale's eyes flicked briefly to Barbara, then to the forged paper, then to the notebook, and sharpened with professional interest. At once, Your Grace. Barbara rose as he began arranging papers. Her legs held this time. The room still smelled of rain and spirits and cooling fire, but the air inside it had altered from panic to purpose. Ravensmere stepped aside to let Mr. Hale reach the inkstand, then turned back to her. You will eat before you faint. It was almost harsh. It was care in the only language he seemed willing to speak. Barbara bowed her head once, in acknowledgement, too tired for argument and too relieved to pretend she was not hungry. Outside, the music carried on for those who had not seen what had nearly been lost, and inside the withdrawing room, while a solicitor copied figures from a captain's daughter's hidden book, Barbara O'Brien watched her father's arithmetic become evidence at last. Mr. Hale's pen moved in quick, dry strokes across laid paper, each line of ink turning Barbara's private vigilance into a formal record that could survive her. She stood beside the chair she had just left and kept both hands clasped at her waist, so no one would see the tremor that remained in her fingers. The Duke did not return to the hearth. He stayed at the table within arm's reach of the notebook, one hand braced on the wood near the forged confession, his body angled toward the door as if any interruption would have to pass through him first. A footman entered with a tray at the Duke's call and set down broth, cold roast, bread, and a cup of tea gone nearly black from steeping. The smell hit Barbara with humiliating force. Salt, fat, warmth. Her stomach tightened so sharply she pressed one knuckle against her stays. Ravensmere did not look at her face. He looked once at the involuntary movement of her hand and said, Eat! I can wait until the copies are complete, Your Grace. No. The single syllable held neither impatience nor raised tone. It carried certainty. She moved to the small table by the window and sat because disobedience now would be theatre, and she had no strength left for theatre. The spoon shook once against porcelain, then steadied. She forced herself to sip slowly, aware of Mr. Hale's pen scratching behind her, and the Duke's silence filling the room like a second structure, harder than oak beams, more difficult to ignore. When the corridor clock struck midnight, the sound travelled through plaster and settled in her chest. Sir Lionel Creed would be waiting in the west card room for the note she had not delivered. Lady Ashcombe would have counted the minutes. Delay had become declaration. She set the spoon down. My lady will come looking for me, Ravensmere answered without turning. She will not cross this threshold. That is not how these evenings work, It is tonight." Mr. Hale paused only long enough to sand the page. The Duke lifted the forged confession and held it toward the candlelight, studying the witness line with expressionless precision. "This name," he said to Hale, tapping the signature, "you will include the burial date in the margin notation?" "Yes, Your Grace." Barbara rose half an inch from her seat before she caught herself. "You already knew he was dead?" Ravensmere folded the paper again. "I knew the date because I read the death notices each quarter. Men who manage estates read what others ignore." The response should have sounded like administrative routine. In his voice, it became warning. He knew where to look when polite rooms preferred not to see. She sat back and lifted the cup with both hands to hide the sudden cold in her skin. Mr. Hale completed one packet, sealed it, and looked to the Duke. "I can carry this to Magistrate Fenwick now, Your Grace. He remains in attendance in the East Rooms." "Go." Ravensmere nodded to the footman at the door. "2 men with him?" Hale gathered pages, bowed to Barbara with professional gravity rather than social condescension, and left under guard. The door closed. Their narrowed world held only firelight, rain at the panes, and the weight of words neither had yet spoken. Barbara took another piece of bread, then stopped before tasting it. "If Lady Ashcombe tells the room I fabricated those entries, they will believe rank before ink." Ravensmere moved at last, circling the table with controlled economy until he stood opposite her by the window. "Some will. Enough will not." "Because you say so." "Because ledgers, bank drafts, and registry books can be compelled to answer." She let out a brief breath that was almost laughter and had no mirth in it. "Compelled by dukes. Compelled by law when a duke refuses to look away." The line struck deeper than command. She looked up. He was close enough now that she could see where old pain had drawn a faint white mark along his right knuckle, a soldier's scar gone pale. Rain traced thin paths down the glass behind him, wavering over the reflection of his shoulders. He had not removed his coat. He seemed carved into it. She chose caution. "Your Grace has no obligation to involve himself in my affairs." His gaze did not leave her. "You are in my affairs. You put your bare hand in my niece's mouth while half this house stood still." "That was necessity." "Yes." He rested one palm flat against the window frame beside her, not touching her, enclosing nothing and still making departure feel like an argument with stone. "Necessity is not why I am still in this room." Her pulse shifted. "Then why?" For a fraction of a second he seemed to weigh whether speech itself was an indulgence he could permit. When he answered, each sentence came stripped to bone. "I watched you enter on foot in rain while Lady Ashcombe remained seated." Barbara held very still. "I watched you stand 3 sets in wet shoes because no one offered you a chair." His jaw tightened once and released. "I watched you eat stale bread in the service corridor beside a crate of oranges and hide it when a gentleman passed." Heat rose behind her eyes so abruptly she hated it. She blinked it back before it could become visible. "You noticed all that," she said. "I noticed my boundaries, my guests, my household." "I am none of those." His mouth flattened. "Do not lie to me to preserve propriety. It does not suit you." The rebuke was low, almost quiet, and harsher for the quiet. She put the bread down untouched. "What suits me, Your Grace, is survival. And what suits Lady Ashcombe is your silence." "She has had years of practice arranging both." He inclined his head by a degree, conceding truth without softening. "No longer." The words landed with the same finality as a door bolt. Barbara looked toward the writing table, where her notebook no longer lay hidden in linen folds, but open beneath ducal candles, copied by ducal order. Terror and relief moved through her in equal measure. Exposure could rescue. Exposure could also destroy if power changed its mind. She rose from the chair, careful, because sudden movement made the room tilt. If you choose to withdraw tomorrow, the damage to me will double. She will say I seduced confidence from a grieving uncle. She will say I manufactured a crisis around a child to force your notice. She has already begun that story. Ravensmere did not interrupt. She will find witnesses willing to remember what helps them. At that his expression altered, a harder stillness than before, like a blade laid flat on velvet. Then listen to mine. He stepped one pace closer. Candlelight cut a pale line along the scar at his temple. You will not return to Lady Ashcombe's lodgings tonight. Barbara stared at him. I have no independent rooms in Bath. You will not return. Your Grace, that would ruin me by dawn. You are already marked by her for disposal by dawn. The truth was so exact it left no room for graceful refusal. She gripped the back of the chair until wood pressed crescents into her palm. Where do you propose I go? To my sister's dower house on Camden Crescent. Mrs. Anstruther is in residence. 2 maids and a matron will receive you. You will have a locked door and a key that remains with you. He gave the details as he gave battlefield directives. Practical first, explanation never. Safety rendered as logistics. Her throat tightened in a way she could not speak through for a moment. You arranged this already. I sent the note when Hale left with the first packet. She had not seen him do it. Of course she had not. He had been 3 moves ahead since the conservatory, and had chosen not to announce it. She managed, You assume I will obey. His eyes held hers, storm grey and unreadable, except for the force beneath restraint. I assume you are too intelligent to walk back into a trap that now knows it has failed. That should have ended it. Instead, he added, lower, as if the line cost him more than the orders had. I also assume you understand that this is protection, not possession. The room seemed to narrow around the sentence. She had been ordered all evening by women who called coercion care. This was different in structure and in intent, yet her body did not forget old cages quickly. She drew breath slowly and let the distinction settle where panic had risen. Very well, she said. I will go to Camden Crescent. A brief nod. Acceptance entered his face as a reduction of tension rather than visible relief. But she saw the minute drop in his shoulders and knew he had been waiting for the answer, as if waiting itself were effort. He turned to the door, called for the footman, and gave instructions in clipped sequence: 1 closed carriage, 4 outriders, no stops, direct route, message to Mrs. Anstruther confirming arrival. Then he sent for a female attendant from his niece's rooms to accompany Barbara immediately. No one could later say she travelled unchaperoned. No one could claim ambiguity. When the footman withdrew, Barbara spoke before caution returned. Why did you dance every set tonight if you were watching corridors? He faced her again. The question hung between them with more danger than any legal paper on the table. He did not answer at once. Rain thinned at the windows. Somewhere down the corridor men laughed too loudly, unaware that the centre of the evening had shifted away from the ballroom floor. At an assembly, he said at last, a duke who breaks pattern too early invites challenge from every idle man in the room. That is politics, not an answer. A flash of something crossed his face, gone before she could name it. He gave her the rest in the same flat tone he used for commands, which made it more revealing, not less. I danced where obligation required. He paused. I did not ask you, because I had already seen your wrist, and I did not trust myself to perform courtesy while pretending not to see it. Silence rushed in behind the words. There was no graceful place to set them down. They remained in the air, irrevocable, Barbara felt her heartbeat in her throat, in her hands, in the bruise beneath the borrowed glove she had not yet replaced. "Your Grace!" A knock at the door cut across her. The interruption was almost violent in its timing. The female attendant entered, bobbing a curtsy. "The carriage is ready, Your Grace. Mrs. Anstruther's house has sent word the Blue Chamber is prepared." Ravensmere did not look away from Barbara while he answered. "You will accompany Miss O'Brien and remain until she is received by Mrs. Anstruther in person." "Yes, Your Grace." Barbara reached for her reticule on the table. Ravensmere moved first, lifted it, checked the clasp, and handed it to her with deliberate care, as if returning a weapon to its rightful owner. Their fingers did not touch. The nearness was enough. "Your notebook remains with Hale until morning," he said. "You will inspect the copies yourself before any filing." She nodded. "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet." The old severity had returned to his voice, but it no longer read as distance. It read as focus, sharpened to a single point. "You will sleep for 4 hours. You will eat again at dawn. Then you will answer questions before a magistrate with the same precision you used tonight. No embellishment, no apology." "I know how to give evidence." "I know." He stepped aside, granting passage to the door. She moved past him with the attendant at her shoulder, then stopped because leaving without one more truth would have felt like cowardice. She turned back. "When you asked who struck my wrist, I thought you wanted scandal." His expression did not change. "I was wrong." A fraction of movement at his mouth, not quite a smile. Recognition, perhaps. She could not read it fully, and that uncertainty felt safer than certainty might have. By the time she reached the corridor, 2 outriders waited at the stair-foot in dark greatcoats, and a third held the carriage door against the wet wind pushing in from the portico. Guests still drifting from supper paused to stare as she passed, with ducal escort and loosened hair, no longer invisible and not yet restored, suspended in that dangerous interval where a woman's life could tilt toward ruin or toward name. At the top of the stairs she glanced back once. Ravensmere remained in the withdrawing-room doorway, one hand on the frame, utterly still despite the draught moving his coat hem. He did not call after her. He did not offer soft reassurances. He watched until she entered the carriage, as if motion itself would not be permitted from him until she was behind glass and iron and guard. The door shut. Wheels took the wet stones. Bath slid past in blurred lamps and rain, and Barbara held her reticule in both hands while the Duke's irreversible words kept pace with the carriage in the dark. The carriage lurched over a rut, and Barbara's shoulder struck the panel hard enough to sting. She welcomed the pain. It kept her from drifting into the dazed disbelief that had followed the Duke's last words. Outside, rain thinned to a mist that silvered the lamps along Camden Crescent. The outriders' hooves kept a strict rhythm, 4 shadows pacing her through the dark as if she were already evidence under guard. Mrs. Anstruther opened the dower house door herself before the footman could knock. She was a narrow woman in black bombazine, grey hair braided flat beneath a cap, eyes sharp with the kind of kindness that had no softness in it. She looked once at Barbara's wet hem, torn seam and loose hair, then stepped aside without question. "Inside, Miss O'Brien. Bolt that door," she told the maid behind her. "No one enters this floor without my permission." The Blue Chamber smelled faintly of starch and lavender. A coal fire had been laid high. Dry linens waited over a screen. On the coverlet, placed with military neatness, lay a small iron key attached to blue ribbon. "Your door," Mrs. Anstruther said. "You keep it. I keep the second." Barbara accepted the key with fingers that had begun to shake again now that she was no longer required to stand before witnesses. Mrs. Anstruther, did your Grace's message arrive? Yes, in his own hand. You are to sleep, if sleep can be had, then take broth, then present yourself at the upper rooms at first light. Magistrate Fenwick has agreed to hear the matter before noon. So the report had landed. The chain held. Mrs. Anstruther's gaze dropped to Barbara's left wrist, where the glove had twisted. "Give me your hand." Barbara obeyed. The older woman peeled back the damp cuff, looked at the bruise, and made no exclamation. "I will bind that lightly. You will raise it on a pillow for 1 hour. Then you will stand straight and ruin a woman who expected you to kneel." Barbara swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." "Eat first." Broth came, then bread with butter melting into it. Barbara finished both because command had become mercy in this long night. She changed into a plain morning dress from Mrs. Anstruther's stores and sat on the bed while the maid unpinned what remained of her hair. When she was finally alone, she locked the door, tied the key ribbon around her wrist above the bruise, and lay down, fully clothed, atop the blanket, because sleep felt too vulnerable to claim honestly. 3 hours passed before Mrs. Anstruther knocked and said, "Dawn." The rain had stopped by the time Barbara stepped from the carriage at the upper rooms again. The stones were still slick. Her slippers were dry this time. 2 uniformed guards stood at the entrance beside Mr. Hale, whose gloves were ink-smudged and whose expression carried the controlled urgency of a man who had not sat once since midnight. He bowed. "Miss O'Brien, the copies were lodged with Magistrate Fenwick. The bank manager from Milsom is present with withdrawal slips. The parish clerk brought the burial register for the false witness. Sir Lionel Creed attempted departure at 1 and was detained by order." Barbara let one breath out, and Lady Ashcombe, in the east anteroom, very composed. "Of course she was." Hale lowered his voice. "Your original notebook is here." He offered the worn book in both hands, not touching its pages. "Please inspect." She opened to her father's initials, then to the copied columns. The tight script remained intact. No pages removed, no ink altered. She nodded once. "It is complete." "Then we proceed." The hearing began in a side chamber and spilled, by necessity and design, into the ballroom as word travelled faster than discretion. Magistrate Fenwick sat at a long table beneath windows gone pale with mourning. He was a square-faced man with careful cuffs and a voice trained to cut through noise without ever rising. Ravensmere stood to one side, coat changed, expression unchanged, distance measured and absolute. Barbara remained near Hale, close enough to hear the scratch of his notes. Lady Ashcombe entered with both daughters, and a face arranged into injured nobility. Sir Lionel Creed came under guard, cravat askew, eyes calculating above a mouth gone thin. He looked once at Barbara and looked away when he found no fear to bargain with. Fenwick began with the forged confession. He read each line aloud. He held up the witness name. The parish clerk gave burial date and entry number in a dry monotone that stripped drama from deceit and therefore made it stronger. Lady Ashcombe laughed lightly. A crude imitation, surely. Anyone could write such nonsense. Hale laid Barbara's copied withdrawals beside bank originals. Amount by amount, date by date, signatures aligned. The bank manager confirmed disbursements drawn on Captain O'Brien's trust and redirected into Sir Ashcombe's gaming debts through instruments endorsed by Lady Ashcombe under a guardianship that expired when Barbara reached majority. Fenwick asked Barbara her age. She answered, 22. "Were you informed of these disbursements?" "No, sir." "Did you consent to marriage settlement with Sir Lionel Creed?" "No, sir." Sir Lionel finally spoke, oily and impatient. "The arrangement was domestic, perfectly ordinary. The girl is dramatic." Ravensmere did not move. Fenwick did. He fixed Sir Lionel with a stare that made the man's next sentence die unfinished. "You will address this court through me," the magistrate said, "not through insult." Lady Ashcombe shifted strategy at once. Tears appeared immaculate and controlled. "I took that child in when she had nothing. This is gratitude. She was always unstable. She invents injury. She seeks consequence for attention." She turned then, deliberately toward Barbara, with a look she had used for years, the look that meant submission or punishment. Ravensmere stepped forward before Barbara could answer. "You will not address Miss O'Brien again." The line cracked through the room. Conversations in the hall stopped. People turned. Fenwick did not rebuke the interruption. Instead, he said, "Given the number of witnesses and the social arena in which these claims were made, this matter will be concluded publicly at once." The doors to the ballroom were opened. Guests who had remained from the night assembly or returned for morning calls drew back in a ring around the centre floor. Silk and wool and whispered speculation pressed into sudden silence. Lady Ashcombe had humiliated Barbara in this room by inches and seasons. Fenwick chose the same boards for judgment. He read the charges clearly: fraud, coercive attempt at forced marriage, falsification of legal instrument, unlawful interference with trust funds. Guards stepped to Lady Ashcombe and Sir Lionel before either could speak over him. Miss Clara began to protest. Miss Henrietta caught her sleeve and whispered, "Do not." It was the first useful thing either had done. Lady Ashcombe's composure broke on the third charge. "You cannot do this to me in public." Fenwick answered, "Madame, you did the acts in private. The consequence is not required to imitate your preference." The guards took the forged ledgers Hale had retrieved at dawn from Ashcombe lodgings under written order. Physical evidence was bagged, marked, and carried out in plain sight. Sir Lionel was led toward the east stair under escort. Lady Ashcombe followed, still speaking, then pleading, then silent when no one answered. The rustle of her silk faded down the corridor that had once cleared for her, as if for royalty. No one moved for several beats after she vanished. The room held that rarest of social sounds, people thinking in real time. Fenwick turned to Barbara. "Miss O'Brien, your legal identity and claim revert in full pending final account restoration. Interim control is placed with court officers and Mr. Hale as temporary fiduciary by consent of His Grace until transfer can be executed this afternoon. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Do you accept?" "I do." "Then it is entered." The magistrate signed. Hale signed. Barbara signed with a hand that only trembled on the first letter, then steadied. Her name lay on the page, unaltered, unqualified, no longer attached to charity or usefulness. Barbara O'Brien. When Fenwick withdrew, the ring of onlookers thinned, then widened again, as Ravensmere crossed the floor toward her. He stopped, one pace away. No touch, no display, only that severe stillness that had become, in her mind, the shape of the trust. "I owe you one statement in the open," he said. She lifted her eyes to his. He spoke without flourish, each word carrying to the edges of the room. "I danced with every woman last night to satisfy obligation. I did not dance with Miss O'Brien because I could not trust my hands to remain formal." A pulse of shocked silence went through the assembly like wind through dry leaves. He held out his hand. Barbara looked at it, then at his face, then placed her fingers in his. The musicians, uncertain and pale, took instruction from one of Ravensmere's men and began a slow measure. They moved into the first steps without speaking. The floorboards were the same. The world standing around them was not. His hand at her waist remained exact, respectful, controlled to the inch. Yet she felt the restraint in him as clearly as heat from a fire held behind iron. Halfway through the set, he leaned closer, voice pitched for her alone. "Stay," she answered before fear could reorder her courage. "On what terms, Your Grace?" "Lawful ones." By full dawn, the chapel at Bathwick was open, candles just lit against the grey morning. Mrs. Anstruther stood as witness with Mr. Hale on one side and Magistrate Fenwick, at Ravensmere's request, on the other to extinguish future gossip at the source. A special licence lay signed on the lectern, sealed and witnessed. Barbara read every line before she gave assent. So did he. When vows were spoken, neither voice shook. When the register came, she signed Barbara O'Brien Ravensmere in clear, careful script, and felt the inversion settle. Not erasure, not purchase, not rescue purchased by silence, but a chosen contract seen by law and by God in the same room. Outside the chapel, early light broke through cloud and turned wet stone pale gold. A courier waited with confirmation from the court office. Captain O'Brien's remaining property and funds, once recovered from seized accounts, were restored to her control under her married name, with separate legal schedule preserved exactly as requested in Hale's filing. Even now, she kept her father's arithmetic. Ravensmere offered his arm. She took it. They descended the chapel steps together while Bath woke around them, indifferent and newly unable to deny what had been done in daylight. At the carriage door he paused, looked down at her wrist where the blue ribbon still circled the fading bruise, and said in that same low command that had carried her through the night, "Keep the key." She closed her hand over it and stepped into her new life with her name intact.